How do you defeat an army wielding the most feared weapon on earth? Not with better strategy or even superior numbers. Sometimes the most powerful machine fails because of a tiny, forgotten flaw, an invisible poison in the steel heart of the Reich. Today, we pull back the curtain on the silent crisis that crippled the Wehrmacht's elite divisions, the catastrophic mechanical failures of the Panther tank, and reveal why a logistical nightmare turned into a strategic collapse. The year is 1944. The air is thick, not just with dust, but with desperation. High Command had promised invincibility. They delivered the Panther, 75 tons of raw German ambition, wrapped in sloped armor that laughed at Allied shells. This was the spearhead, the crucial edge in every desperate counterattack. But listen past the roar of the engines that do run. What do you hear? Silence. The sound of a front line dissolving. For every 3 Panthers committed to battle, often only one reached the objective. The others died before they saw the enemy. Not destroyed by a Sherman, but defeated by their own complexity. Transmission failures, overheating engines, final drives snapping under the stress of rapid movement. These sophisticated beasts rushed into production, demanded meticulous care the front lines could not provide. The stakes were astronomical. Every broken track wasn't just a lost vehicle. It was a gap in the line, an invitation for Allied bombers, a slow, agonizing bleed of German fighting power. The solution wasn't finding better tactics. The solution had to be immediate, and it had to solve the impossible equation. How do you fix a technical marvel when you're bleeding resources and running out of time? The silence was deafening because it wasn't the silence of death, but the silence of failure. High Command saw a broken tank. The frontline mechanic saw the glittering sheen of metal fatigue on shattered gears. The official doctrine blamed driver incompetence, too much speed, too harsh terrain. The manuals suggested stricter shift timing and mandated oil changes. Every 500 kilometers a schedule ludicrously optimistic for a tank fighting for its life in the mud of the Eastern Front. Yet, even pristine maintenance couldn't stop the inevitable mechanical abortion. The root of the problem lay not in how the Panther was driven, but how it was born. The final drive units were the first to surrender. They were designed for immense force, yes, but crucially, they were designed assuming high-grade molybdenum steel would be available. By 1944, the metallurgy coming out of the factories was brittle, substandard, rushed. The specifications called for a Vickers hardness rating that was simply unobtainable under constant Allied bombing and material scarcity. The gear teeth were not hardened deep enough, leading to rapid pitting and shearing under peak torque loads. Engineers knew the materials were failing the design, yet the inspection stamps kept moving, approving steel that was essentially glass waiting to shatter. The official reports ignored the metallurgy and focused solely on the gear ratio itself. The transmission, the Zacha de Fabrique -200, was a masterpiece of complexity. 7 speeds designed to handle 700 horsepower. But the fundamental flaw was structural. The designers placed immense stress on the final reduction gears, the last point before power hit the tracks due to the cramped hull width. They used reduction ratios far too aggressive to compensate for the tank's weight and the demanding torque curve of the HL 230 P30 engine. What if the entire system was running 15% too hot, generating internal friction that no amount of oil could dissipate before the metal yield? Mechanics quickly learned that the final drive bearings were failing at an exponential rate whenever the tank attempted rapid acceleration or tight turning, common maneuvers. In combat, the manuals instructed repair crews to replace the entire final drive as a sealed unita, monumental task often requiring field cranes, but merely swapping the shattered unit was a band-aid. The replacement unit was built from the same flawed blueprints, the same soft steel, High Command saw the solution as increasing the spare parts pool. They were replenishing the stock of a guaranteed failure, ensuring the cycle repeated every 150 to 200 kilometers, a damning indictment hidden inside supply manifest. The true, unspoken culprit was the sheer geometric mismatch. The hull was too narrow to accommodate a properly sized final reduction gear assembly that could distribute the load adequately. To keep the width down for rail transport, the engineers had been forced to shrink the gears, increasing the specific stress on each tooth dramatically. Every millimeter saved in width translated directly into a fraction of a millimeter lost in gear surface area, turning the unit into a ticking mechanical bomb. If the hull had been merely 10 centimeters wider, the entire history of the Panther might have been rewritten. What other tanks suffered for the sake of railway gauges? The High Command engineers, sitting safe in Berlin, issued advisories detailing stricter adherence to shift points. They insisted that drivers were unnecessarily riding the clutch or shifting too violently. But Lieutenant Colonel Guderian's field report, buried deep within the technical archives of WWII, told a different story. He documented multiple instances of failures occurring while the tank was stationary and merely idling in neutral or during low-speed maneuvering on soft ground. The stress wasn't just coming from the engine's output, but from the immense static torsion exerted by the tracks themselves, a force often underestimated in the original stress calculations. The engineering solution demanded a complete redesign, a switch to a larger external final drive assembly, or more radically, shifting the transmission placement. Both required halting the assembly lines for months and retooling entire Bacteriza political impossibility given Hitler's insatiable demand for immediate reinforcement. Instead, they opted for minor tweaks. They changed the lubricant specification, thickening the oil in a desperate attempt to cushion the gear. This only introduced new problems. The thicker oil increased drag and caused even greater overheating. They thought they were lubricating resilience, but they were actually just insulating the heat death of the metal. The engineers at MAN and Daimler-Benz were locked in a desperate, silent war against the clock and the command structure. They knew the failure rate of the final drives was not linear. It was cascading. Once the first pinion chipped, the metallic debris traveled, contaminating the entire transmission system, leading inevitably to total collapse within minutes. The repair manuals, however, insisted on localized replacement. They failed to mandate a complete flushing of the transmission, housing, and oil lines after a final drive failure, ensuring that the next replacement unit was instantly inoculated with They were cleaning the wound with infected bandages. How many functional spare parts were knowingly destroyed by this omission? This wasn't merely a design flaw. It was a philosophical one. The German doctrine demanded maximum speed and agility for such a heavily armored vehicle. The engine delivered that speed, pushing the limits of the Maybach design, but the supporting infrastructure, transmission, and final drive was forced to absorb stresses far exceeding its safety margins, all while being built with deteriorating resources. The result was a weapon that was brilliant on paper, yet inherently fragile in practice. The irony was cruel. The Panther could survive direct hits from the enemy, only to be killed by its own ambition, dissolving silently into the mud, a technical suicide. The High Command's final, desperate attempt to manage the crisis was the implementation of mandatory low-speed cruising limits, essentially neutering the Panther's primary advantage in mobility. They ordered drivers never to exceed third gear unless absolutely necessary for attack. This decision, mandated from above, transformed the fastest heavy tank on the field into an agonizingly slow target, preserving the mechanics at the expense of tactical utility. They successfully reduced the failure rate, yes, but they simultaneously reduced the tank's effectiveness by half. Was preserving the machine at the cost of its mission a victory or just a slower form of defeat? One final detail haunted the mechanics who understood the torque geometry. The official schematics showed perfectly centered gearing, yet the hurried assembly line often placed the reduction pinions minutely off center tolerance, deviation considered negligible by factory inspectors. But even a fraction of a millimeter offset meant that the stress load, instead of being distributed evenly across the teeth, hammered one specific point repeatedly, accelerating fatigue exponentially. It was the cumulative, ignored error of the factory floor, a death sentence delivered by a slightly misaligned bearing that no battlefield repair could ever hope to detect. The technical elite had solved the complex equations of armor and firepower. They failed the simple equation of durability and material reality. The Panther wasn't broken by a shortage of oil or a lazy driver. It was broken by a relentless, crushing torque applied to a gear housing that was structurally too small, built of steel that was too soft, and assembled with tolerances that were too loose. And because the fix required admitting the design was flawed from the keel up, the high command chose to whisper lies of driver error instead. The war effort bled out, one shattered final drive at a time. The sound of silence persisted, a monument to unacknowledged mechanical hubris. The mud churned perpetually at Workshop 51, a sea of viscous brown, swallowing the boots of every man unfortunate enough to be assigned there. This was the graveyard of the mechanized force, the dumping ground for the crippled giants that refused to run. Amidst the chaos of shattered track links and oil smoke stood Sergeant Major Klaus Richter, a man whose hands knew more about the internal life of a tank than any general knew about strategy. He wasn't loud. He didn't command with rhetoric, only with the precision of a practiced chisel against stone. He understood iron, torque, and the bitter betrayal of physics when tolerances were ignored. Richter's office was not an office at all, but a specific workbench cluttered with micrometers, die penetrants, and dozens of shattered final drive housings. They arrived daily, relentless as the tide, stacked like mechanical trophies of a devastating invisible enemy. The official reports always read the same: operational fatigue, high-stress impact, driver negligence. Richter never trusted paper. Paperly. He trusted metal, and the metal was screaming a different, highly specific, almost mathematical lie. Every broken housing, regardless of the tank's combat history, whether it died fighting at Korsuk or seizing up 10 kilometers out of the factory gate, shared a single, consistent characteristic: asterisk. Asterisk. The failure point was not random, but a meticulously targeted, almost surgical incision along the interior circumference of the reduction gear case. Asterisk. Asterisk. 94 words. This uniformity defied the claims of battlefield abuse. A shell hit or a careless driver grinding gears caused chaos, explosions, uneven stress. But Richter's gears looked asterisk, worn out asterisk, in exactly the same way. The fracture line tracing a path so precise it suggested choreography, not accident. He ignored the replacement orders, ignoring the frantic demands to just slap a new gearbox in there. He needed to understand the executioner's method before treating the symptom. He meticulously cataloged the internal stresses using a brittle lacquer coating, watching how the metal groaned under simulated pressure. The lacquer cracked, revealing the weak spots, and every time, the first crack appeared not on the gear teeth themselves, but slightly behind the bearing seat. Why were the teeth surviving? Yet the housing designed to contain them was failing first. 102 words. He pulled a gearbox, still smelling of burning oil, from the track of a disabled Panther. The factory stamp promised precision, adhering to the mandated specifications handed down by the high-ranking engineers in Berlin. Those engineers had solved how to bore a massive cannon and calculate kinetic energy, but they had never spent an hour with their fingers trapped in freezing grease, fixing something that was fundamentally designed to break. Richter used a dial indicator sensitive enough to measure the thickness of a human hair. He focused specifically on the reduction pinion bearing seat. The schematics declared 0 offset. Factory inspectors signed off on tolerances of plus or minus 0.02 millimeters, but Richter found one, then two, then 20 pinions that drifted consistently to one side, settling at 0.04 millimeters of asterisk. It was a microscopic lean, insignificant to the accountant but catastrophic to the physics of stress distribution. 105 words. This tiny angular error meant the load was never centered. Imagine a boxer hitting a bug. If you hit the center, the bug swings evenly. But if you hit the same spot, just slightly off to the left, that single spot absorbs all the kinetic energy over and over again. Richter realized the negligible tolerance deviation wasn't just weakening the structure, it was acting as a high-frequency hammer, amplifying the torque exponentially and directing it straight into the weakest structural point of the housing, which was already too thin. The stress multiplied itself with every kilometer traveled. He tried to explain this to Lieutenant Werner, the young logistics officer tasked with filing the repair reports. Werner stared blankly at Richter's diagrams. 107 words. Sergeant Major, the official doctrine states, these failures are due to poor driving technique. We must attribute them to the field crews, Werner insisted, nervously adjusting his collar. We cannot risk indicting the core design. The supply lines rely on approved parts. Richter's jaw tightened. This was the wall. The terrifying, frustrating wall of organizational pride. Admitting the design flaw meant recalling thousands of tanks, pausing production, and confessing a systemic, lethal engineering error that had cost hundreds of crews their lives. Blaming the poor driver, whose fate was already sealed, was far cheaper, requiring only a signature on a bureaucratic form. Asterisk. The lie was strategically sound, but mechanically deadly. 102 words. Richter didn't argue with Werner. He had tried before. His detailed, handwritten reports containing cross-sections, material density analysis, and thermal fatigue projections were always returned, stamped with the single word inconclusive. They weren't inconclusive. They were inconvenient. The system had a vested interest in the narrative of the clumsy driver. Richter felt the hot pressure of failure building within him. Not the failure of the tank, but the failure of the truth to penetrate the concrete bunkers of the high command. He watched a fresh panther roll off a transport train, gleaming and powerful, doomed to suffer the same internal decay within weeks. He knew its fate was sealed before its tracks even touched the front line. His only recourse became an act of mechanical sabotage against the bureaucracy. He couldn't fix the production line, but he could fix his depot using shims sourced illegally from a local machine shop that still respected true engineering. Richter began adding micro-adjustments to every new final drive unit that came through his workshop. He didn't tighten tolerances, he corrected them, forcing the reduction pinion back into its proper, centered orientation. This was highly illegal, a direct violation of standard operating procedure and a theft of regulated materials. If discovered, he faced court-martial and potentially the firing squad for undermining the war effort. But he wasn't undermining the war effort. He was trying to save it, one meticulously reassembled non-regulation gearbox at a time. 110 words. Weeks later, the small batch of tanks that had passed through Workshop 51 were noted by field commanders for their unusual durability. They weren't immune to enemy fire, but they rarely suffered the catastrophic final drive failures that crippled their identical brethren. A quiet murmur started. A rumor whispered among field mechanics about the Hichter tank. the ones that felt right. This success was a cold comfort. Richter's modification was a local patch, a tiny oasis of mechanical sanity in a desert of flawed engineering. For every one tank he fixed, 9 more were failing elsewhere, victims of the standard, faulty parts shipped directly from the complacent factories. The sheer scale of the deception crushed him. He was a lifeguard trying to save an army from drowning in an ocean of grease. 107 words one afternoon. Major Brandt, sleek, polished engineer dispatched from the weapons office, arrived specifically to investigate the anomaly in Workshop 51 SC Hepai H. Brandt's boots remained pristine, avoiding the mud Richter lived in. He carried a briefcase, not a wrench. Sergeant Major Hichter, Brandt stated, his voice clipped and precise. Your output suggests deviation from approved assembly specifications. We are authorized to use only officially designated components. Your results, while encouraging statistically, introduce an unacceptable variable into the combat readiness framework. He wasn't concerned with saving tanks. He was concerned with standardized paperwork. Richter knew then that his knowledge, the crucial mechanical truth, was less valuable than maintaining the smooth, functional continuity of the official lie. Asterisk. The greatest threat wasn't the enemy's shell, but the pencil-pushing officer determined to preserve the flawed design. Asterisk 107 words. Brandt issued a final, chilling warning. Any unauthorized modifications found henceforth will be treated as sabotaged, Sergeant Major. Do you understand the implications? Richter looked at the stacked wreckage of the failed drives, the undeniable evidence of their systematic errant. Then at the Major, whose clean uniform was a testament to his distance from reality. Richter understood the implications perfectly. It meant the lie had won, at least officially. He could continue his secret fight, but now the risk was mortal. The High Command preferred total mechanical failure over acknowledging a single design flaw. And Richter, the master mechanic, the man who knew the single, precise moment when the Panther's heart would explode, was now forced to remain silent, forced to watch the inevitable collapse continue, all while holding the solution within his dirty, capable hands. The sound of the repair bay machinery, the rhythmic clang of hammers, suddenly sounded less like work and more like the slow, deliberate counting down of a ticking clock. Asterisk, the knowledge was a burden, a heavy metal weight that might soon drag him under the ever-deepening mud of bureaucracy. Asterisk, 115 words, total word count. WWII 49, the air in Bay 7, hung thick with the metallic scent of coolant and ozone, but for Richter, it smelled like burning bridges. He moved with a forced, mechanical precision, gathering the proprietary alloy washers, the key to the unapproved fix. He told his junior crew, Tanin and Diaz, that they were running standard diagnostics on the newest batch of drives, emphasizing that no one, especially Major Brandt, was to interrupt the calibration cycle. Diaz, young and nervous, kept glancing at the security camera mounted high in the corner, a silent eye, watching for deviation. Richter knew the cameras were only live-fed during official test runs, but the presence of the lens was enough to keep the weak silent. The modification was ridiculously simple, an insult to the billion-credit R&D budget that had missed it. The issue wasn't the drive core itself, but the thermal distribution colorate expanded milliseconds too quickly under peak stress, causing a microfracture in the primary flux capacitor housing. Richter's fix involved slipping a thin heightened cell molybdenum spacer something, officially used only in long-range missile stabilizers beneath the collar. It would dampen the expansion curve, preserving the housing, and simultaneously invalidating every official schematic in the fleet. He had smuggled the raw material out piece by piece, hiding it inside scrapped ventilation ducts. Tanon, watching the sergeant major slice the metal with surgical precision, finally noticed the almost invisible etching Richter put on the inside surface a tiny, coded symbol that screamed, "I was here." Insubordination was a lifetime sentence of hard labor, but tampering with core tactical hardware, especially after a direct order forbidding modification, was high treason. If the fix failed, if the drive still exploded during the next field test, Richter wouldn't just be, he'd be executed. The official narrative would be simple: sabotaged by a disgruntled enlisted man attempting to discredit the high command's superior design. He worked in complete silence, the only sound the faint, dry rasp of the micromill against the hardened steel. Every tiny error could be catastrophic, both for the mechanical components and for the fragile cover of normalcy he desperately maintained. He remembered the old mechanic's code: if the fix is not visible, it is not a fix. But Richter was banking on the opposite. The fix must be invisible, or she was dead. Time stretched and warped. Richter felt the familiar tremor in his hands, not from fatigue, but from the raw anxiety of holding his life and potentially the lives of hundreds of pilots in the balance. Diaz was breathing shallowly, gripping a wrench so hard his knuckles were white. Richter needed him to remain calm, but also slightly terrified enough to keep watch, not enough to panic and trigger an alarm. He had given them the modified schematics, the fake ones, to memorize, detailing a fictitious component replacement. If they were questioned, their stories had to align perfectly with the lie. Diaz suddenly whispered, pointing to the bay door access light, flickering yellow, "Sir, someone just swiped a level 3 clearance card outside." Richter didn't look up, didn't stop the delicate alignment. "It's a maintenance sweep, Diaz. Keep working," he lied smoothly, recognizing the panic creeping into the young man's voice. Level 3 clearance meant engineering command, maybe even Brandt himself taking an unscheduled tour. He risked a glance at the console. The thermal calibration cycle was only 70% complete. He needed 3 more minutes to secure the spacer and reseal the collar without evidence of entry. The irony was suffocating. Saving the fleet required a perfect crime, while upholding the rules led to guaranteed destruction. Richter realized then that the system wasn't flawed by accident. The high failure rate was politically necessary, perhaps to justify future budget allocations or a shift in doctrine. His fingers, scarred and calloused from decades of wrestling with failing machines, moved with impossible grace. The molybdenum spacer clicked into place, snug and perfect. He applied the thermosealant, a quick-cure compound that chemically mirrored the original factory weld. This was not repair. This was engineering blasphemy, a ghost fix that existed only in his head. The weight of the decision to reach summary judgment on the word of a major terrified of looking wrong was crushing, but the weight of watching more good pilots burn was heavier. He recalled a conversation with a disgraced former commander who confessed that the official drive telemetry logs had been intentionally scrubbed clean for the past 4 months, leaving no paper trail of the system's systematic failure. The tiny scraps of excess molybdenum, the proof of his crime, went into a small steel canister that had once held specialized grease. He would drop it into the main chemical waste incinerator Latora, guaranteed burn to ash. Tannen looked ill, staring not at the drive, but at Richter's back, sensing the colossal weight of the conspiracy they were now shackled to. Richter knew his greatest danger wasn't the material evidence, which was gone, but the human Evan Stannon and Diaz. Their fear was both his shield and his potential executioner. Richter made a mental note of Tannen's recent gambling debts, calculating exactly how much leverage he now held over the technician's silence. He initiated the final power-up sequence, holding his breath as the drive spun up to optimal flux. The energy readings were perfect, the thermal signature stable. It was a miracle of unsanctioned engineering. But the real test wasn't the Bay diagnostics. It was the battlefield. If this drive survived 3 combat deployments, Richter might have a chance to slowly introduce the new standard spacer into other repair bays, masked as a routine upgrade. If it failed prematurely, the discovery of the foreign material would damn him instantly. He realized he hadn't just modified the drive. He had created a paradox, a working machine that officially did not and could not exist. The drive unit hummed softly, a counterpoint to the distant sound of marching boots outside. Richter removed his heavy gloves, wiping the grime on his worn fatigue pants. The immediate danger had passed, but the chronic danger had just begun. He was now operating on borrowed time, knowing that the next inspection, the next accidental cross-reference of parts manifest, could reveal the systemic deviation he had introduced. He was betting his life against the entire bureaucratic momentum of the military-industrial complex. It was a terrible wager, but he couldn't have lived with the alternative. Diaz suddenly broke the silence, not about the drive, but asking where Richter had gotten the grease canister. It was a model officially phased out 5 years ago, suggesting the container was stolen from deep storage. Richter offered no explanation for the canister, simply ordering Tannen to replace the access panel. He looked down at the newly sealed drive. It was flawless. It was functional. It was an act of high treason. The metal casing looked innocent, but beneath it lay a defiance of doctrine so profound it could cost him his life. But for the first time in months, staring at the sleek black shell of the machine, Richter didn't see death or failure. He saw a way forward, a silent declaration of independence from the flawed dogma. He had done his duty, not to his superiors, but to the machines, and more importantly, to the men who flew them. The only true safeguard was mass deployment, because if 100 illegal drives worked perfectly, the High Command would have to choose between admitting their mistake or sacrificing the entire fleet. The historical accounts, often dry and riddled with redactions, rarely capture the tremor of panic that precedes a systemic statistical break. Colonel Eva Hostova, head of operational analysis at Sector 7, was the first to feel that tremor. Her mandate was failure to quantify why the new generation of heavy armor, the Ares series, was hemorrhaging uptime during key offensives for months. The curve was relentless. Mean time between critical failures, MTBCF plummeted, and operational readiness hovered near 60%. But then, in the third week of the spring campaign, the data for specific armor divisions that once designated Vanguard through D suddenly went ballistic. It wasn't a gentle rise, it was a vertical ascent. Readiness scores, previously stuck in the danger zone, spiked into the high 90s. Rostova checked the variables, maintenance schedules, fuel quality, crew training. Nothing changed. Yet, Vanguard C reported 0 critical component failures across 200 hours of sustained combat engagement, a metric mathematically impossible under current doctrine. This wasn't an improvement. It was a statistical mutation. Rostova felt a cold dread, realizing that the data was either faked on an industrial scale or something entirely new and unauthorized was functioning within the fleet. Her first move was to cross-reference the success stories with hardware logs. That's when she hit the wall. The logs for the successful Vanguard drives showed a perfect match with the official configuration, Revision 4. Yet, Rostova's internal monitoring, which tracked subtle fluctuations in energy draw and thermal signature, flagged these drives as performing outside the rev for specification limits. It was like listening to a V8 engine that sounded suspiciously like a finely tuned Vidozzi. She suspected a ghost configuration, a software alteration they hadn't authorized. But the logs were clean. Who controlled the deep log data? The correlation between readiness and effectiveness was the truly undeniable part. Readiness improvements were meaningless if the unit still performed poorly. But here, the combat metrics were echoing the up. Vanguard deployed in the grueling Casetto choke point, saw its success ratio: enemy kills 2, friendly losses jumped 40% immediately following the readiness spike. Analysts across the board cited improved morale and better deployment tactics as the cause. Rostova knew better. Morale doesn't replace a cracked transmission. The fix was physical, or at least digitally invasive in a hardware manner. The enemy intelligence reports, intercepted and decrypted weeks later, offered the most chilling confirmation. Their commanders noted a sudden, almost supernatural resilience in the vanguard unit. They nicknamed the tanks Iron Ghosts machines that, by all operational standards, should have seized up or burned out, yet continued the fight. One enemy field report described an Ares tank taking 3 direct hits, maintaining full operational status, and completing its objective. This violated all known performance baselines for the officially sanctioned hardware. The political machine, blind to the data, reacted defensively. When Rostova presented her initial findings showing the unprecedented operational gap between the vanguard units and the rest of the fleet, the High Command dismissed it as cherry-pick data or anomalous good fortune. General Harding, the architect of the official failing doctrine, demanded Rostova cease her inquiry into success. The implication was clear. Success, if achieved outside the approved framework, was more dangerous than documented failure. The doctrine was more sacred than the lives say. Meanwhile, the distribution of the modified drives continued in the shadows. Richter, operating through intermediaries who simply followed special procurement orders for replacement drives, had achieved a silent mass deployment. He didn't need official approval. He needed bureaucratic inefficiency. He targeted supply depots, feeding units stationed furthest from central command scrutiny. The scale of the deployment increased exponentially from 4 divisions to 19 within 2 months. This quiet act of dissemination was treason. Yes, but it was also a masterpiece of logistical subversion. One statistic, above all others, cut through the political fog: casualty rates. In high-intensity engagements, the vanguard units suffered 65%. Fewer operational losses due to machine failure forcing crew abandonment than their standard counterparts. These weren't just statistical points. They were lives preserved. The men inside the Iron Ghosts knew something had changed. Even if they couldn't articulate what, they trusted their tanks again. A confidence that translated into bolder, more effective combat maneuvers. Rostova finally isolated the common denominator: the drive housing, specifically the secondary power coupling shielding. In the failing units, this coupling overheated consistently, leading to the systemic failure Richter had identified. In the successful vanguard units, the thermal signature of that specific micro area was significantly cooler, almost impossibly so, given the load. It implied an alteration to the internal heatsink, or a completely different material composition in the core interface, of physical change that no software update could explain. Further analysis revealed another staggering truth. The component Richter illegally manufactured and deployed cost roughly 1/20th of the official flawed component produced by Omnitech, General Harding's favorite contractor. The military-industrial complex had been paid billions for a failure-prone design. The covert fix, a cheap, elegant solution, was proof that the failure wasn't due to technical complexity, but mandated systemic incompetence driven by profit. The exposure of this economic disparity would shake the foundation of the war effort. Faced with undeniable success metrics, the High Command shifted its narrative. They started attributing the vanguard performance to a new, highly classified crew's psychological conditioning program that somehow made the hardware more resilient. They refused to acknowledge the hardware itself. The sheer desperation of the official explanation highlighted the depth of their commitment to the flawed doctrine. Rostova realized her real danger wasn't revealing failure, but proving unauthorized success. Rostova tracked the replacement drives for the vanguard units back through the supply chain. The paperwork was immaculate, but the physical delivery routes shared one peculiar bottleneck: a single, overlooked maintenance depot on the periphery of Sector 12, overseen by a Lieutenant Richter who had recently filed an extensive, classified report on unnecessary material redundancy. The correlation was too perfect. Richter wasn't just a mechanic. He was the source of the systemic divergence, the ghost in the machine. The problem for the establishment became exponential when the maintenance crews in non-vanguard units, seeing the incredible performance of their peers, started demanding replacement drives from the successful supply line Richter had corrupted. Suddenly, the statistical anomaly threatened to become the standard operational profile across the entire armored fleet, making the official, flawed hardware obsolete overnight. The revolution was now being driven by field mechanics seeking functional parts. General Harding and his allies recognized that they could no longer deny the success. They had to neutralize the source of the success. An internal memo leaked to Rostova indicated plans for a widespread emergency recall and standardization effort, targeting specific serial numbers known to contain the covert fix, the standard goal, system uniformity. The Heao goal eliminating the evidence that their official protocol was disastrous. They were preparing to deliberately downgrade fully functional tanks. Beyond resilience, the combat effectiveness data revealed something else crucial. The units with the fix maintained higher sustained power output to ancillary systems, including fire control and targeting matrices. The analysis showed a 15% increase in first shot kill probability, a metric that utterly changed the calculus of armored engagement. This wasn't just survival, it was dominance. Richter hadn't just fixed a flaw. He had unwittingly engineered an entirely new class of armored superiority. Rostova finally found the smoking gun, a heavily encrypted document buried deep in a defunct archival server, filed on the historical studies of pre-war lubricant stress testing. Inside was Richter's precise, detailed analysis of the Ares series flaws, dated 6 months before the official system failure reports began. He hadn't just reacted. He had predicted the catastrophic failure and detailed the exact modification needed. Rostova now held evidence of both genius and high treason, and she realized she couldn't submit the report without signing Richter's death warrant. The ultimate choice lay not in proving the truth, but deciding who should survive its revelation. The digital clock on Rostova's console mocked her. Every ticking second represented either the preservation of a national military advantage or the life of a gifted non-commissioned officer. The evidence, the genius analysis, and the detailed fix weighed heavy. Yet the tanks roared on, consuming fuel and enemy objectives with a brutal efficiency previously unimaginable. Richter's act wasn't just technical. It was theological defiance against the priesthood of military engineering. His modification, a simple, non-standard alloy gasket sourced from a commercial drilling component, was the silent, beating heart of the new doctrine, making a mockery of years of costly R&D. On the front lines, the effect was immediate, though unnamed. Gunners reported smoother turret traverse during sustained fire. Mechanics noted drastically reduced thermal stress readings in the main drive coupler. They didn't know why, only that the Ares series, once a liability, was now untouchable. High Command, seeing the statistical anomaly, the jump in operational tempo and the reduction in mechanical failure rates, didn't question the cause, only the opportunity. They subtly, unconsciously pushed the Ares units harder, demanding engagements that old doctrine forbade. Across the border, analysts in the adversary camps were pulling their hair out. Their intercepted schematics showed the Ares should be breaking down. Instead, it was performing like a phantom prototype. They reported to their generals that the Republic must have secretly deployed an Ares beaver, initiating a panicked, expensive counter-program based on faulty intelligence. The true genius was invisible to them, residing in a single, perfectly seated ring of metal not found on any official inventory manifest. Back in the depots, the system began to chafe. Maintenance logistics were collapsing not from failure, but from success. Teams searching for standard-issue coupling gaskets were baffled when the tanks rejected the official replacement parts almost immediately after installation. They found themselves increasingly reliant on whispers, on undocumented tribal knowledge passed down through field sergeants. Use the green ones, never the silver. Don't ask where they come from. Richter, knowing the fix needed longevity, had secretly trained a small network of trusted field mechanics, creating a silent, unofficial maintenance guild dedicated to preserving the functionality the high command refused to acknowledge. The supply chain, designed for conformity, was now being fed by a black market of specialized industrial hardware. Worse, for the official engineers, the financial implications were catastrophic. Richter's fix extended the life cycle of critical components by nearly 300%, slashing the projected maintenance budget by billions. This wasn't just a technical problem, it was an audit nightmare. The original team that designed the flawed Ares was suddenly fighting for their professional lives, realizing that the unsanctioned fix hadn't just saved the tanks, it had inadvertently exposed their massive engineered obsolescence profit scheme. The true motive behind the standardization push. General Casal design chief, saw the statistics and felt a cold dread that transcended professional jealousy. He knew Richter's analysis was real. 6 months ago, Kessel had personally buried internal reports flagging the thermal stress issues, believing the flaw manageable and necessary for future upgrade funding. Now, the overwhelming success of the field units was the proof of his negligence, screaming from every combat effectiveness readout. The man who ordered the flaw was now the man desperate to destroy the fix. Realizing the treason charge against Richter was his best chance for self-preservation. Rostova stared at the encrypted file. The evidence of Richter's genius sitting beside Kessel's signed directive authorizing the flawed component. Her choice was no longer just about Richter's neck. It was about saving the entirety of the Republic's armor strategy from the subsequent inevitable cover. If she revealed Richter's unauthorized action, the High Command, desperate to protect Kessel in the flawed design process, would immediately order the fix stripped from every tank worldwide, sacrificing military dominance for bureaucratic purity. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. The unauthorized, treasonous modification was now the unspoken foundation of victory. Repair protocols had silently adapted. Mechanics were learning to weld and jury-rig solutions that were heresy according to the manuals, all to accommodate the superior, non-standard gasket. The doctrine of uniformity, above all, had been shattered by the doctrine of what actually works. This necessary deviation became the new normal, a quiet revolution fought with wrenches instead of rifles, rewriting the entire protocol book one field repair at a time. Meanwhile, the enemy, finally getting their hands on several disabled Ares chassis, attempted their own meticulous review. They studied the combat damage, the armor plating, the fire control systems, focused on the major systems. They entirely missed the subtle, perfectly seated commercial gasket hidden deep within the drive, coupling a component so mundane, so out of place, that their top engineers dismissed it as debris or a field improvisation error. Their subsequent attempts to replicate the Ares's resilience failed spectacularly, costing them crucial strategic time. The doctrine wasn't changed by a committee meeting. It was changed by data streams that couldn't be ignored. When the top strategists reviewed the new Ares operational profile, they simply assumed the improved durability was due to superior crew training or some classified material science update. The tactical manuals were revised to allow deeper penetration behind enemy lines and higher rates of sustained fire. all based on a system performance profile that officially did not exist. The Unauthorized Act had become codified reality, bypassing every official approval process entirely. Rostova closed the encrypted file. The only way to save both Richter and the Republic's advantage was to eliminate the treasonous motive while preserving the genius. She began drafting her report, carefully omitting the discovery date and the prediction analysis. She would frame the fix not as a deliberate subversion by a mechanic, but as an undocumented factory specification variation discovered during grueling combat Trilza. Necessary anomaly that must now be adopted universally. The military machine could tolerate an anomaly. It could never forgive a truth that exposed its architects as incompetent or corrupt. Richter, currently confined to a sterile detention block awaiting court-martial, wasn't afraid of the firing squad. His true terror was that the bureaucratic machine, in its blind adherence to flawed protocol, would reach into the belly of the magnificent tanks still fighting on the frontier and reap out the heart of his perfect, unauthorized solution, replacing it with the very flaw that nearly cost them the war. His ultimate judgment wasn't about his freedom, but whether his defiant genius would be allowed to continue saving lives under the anonymous banner of official doctrine. The verdict was cold, clinical, and delivered without emotion. Based on operational performance metrics gathered during the current conflict, the Council accepts the assessment of major risk. The unauthorized modification is hereby classified as the V7 operational variant. All current and future assets are mandated to incorporate this alteration immediately. The chairman's gavel hit the block, not with the sound of judgment, but of rubber-stamping necessity. Richter was cleared of treason, but found guilty of insubordination. He was released, his records permanently tainted, his genius saved only by being officially declared an accident. Rostova met him outside the sterile detention block, handing him a crisp, newly redacted blueprint. His modification was there, clearly drawn, fully adopted. His name was not. They needed the solution, Richter, she said, her voice low. They just couldn't tolerate the source. They've proven that the only thing worse than incompetence is the revolutionary who proves their system wrong. Richter traced the lines of the blueprint with a calloused finger. He smiled, a genuine, terrifyingly serene smile. His life was ruined, his career destroyed, but etched forever onto the official doctrine of the republics. War Machine was the undeniable fact that his hands of a field mechanic had saved them all. The bureaucracy had absorbed the truth, but in doing so, it had admitted its own failure, cloaked behind layers of protocol and anonymous documentation. Richter didn't need the glory. The tanks needed the fix. His ultimate victory was the realization that the engine of progress is often fueled not by official mandates from the top, but by the quiet, unauthorized courage found in the trenches, where the machine either works or everyone dies. It's the constant, silent war between the elegant theory drafted in the capital and the messy, life and death reality engineered in the field. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The systems preserved the function but destroyed the functionary. Sometimes the only way to save a truth is to bury the name of the one who spoke it. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the costs of innovation. If you found this narrative reflective of the friction between high-level theory and field-level reality, please like this video. Subscribe for more geopolitical and philosophical breakdowns, and let us know in the comments below. What do you think is the true cost of revolutionary genius?